What is up, everybody? In this video, I want to talk about the architecture of choice, free will, fate, and the legal geography of euthanasia. But before we get started, with peace and love, subscribe, like, comment, and share if you dare, because the algorithm do not care. Yeah. Alright. So, this is a pretty rough subject for some people, so I'll say trigger warning if it's hard for you to talk about death or suicide or euthanasia. So the legalization of euthanasia in a small minority of jurisdictions presents a profound philosophical puzzle. If the principle of free will is universal, if each consciousness possesses an equal claim to self-determination, why does the legal right to choose the manner and timing of one's death remain a geographically contingent privilege? This essay argues that the tension between the universal aspiration of free will and the localized reality of euthanasia law reveals something fundamental about the nature of autonomy itself. Drawing on liberal philosophical traditions and their critics, I contend that the free will versus euthanasia debate has been misframed. The central issue is not whether individuals possess the sovereign right to choose death, but whether any choice about death can be fully autonomous when situated within structures of power, vulnerability, and social meaning that precede and exceed the individual will. The uneven legal landscape of euthanasia, I suggest, reflects not merely political caution, but an implicit recognition that free will and fate are not opposites in this domain. They are inextricably intertwined. So, let's begin with the geography of dying. Well, in 1992, a Canadian woman named Sue Rodriguez posed a question to a parliamentary committee that continues to resonate through legal and philosophical debates about euthanasia. If I cannot approve my own death, then whose body is this? Who owns my life? Rodriguez, suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, was asking the liberal question in its purest form, the question of self-possession, of sovereign authority over the boundaries of one's existence. Yet the answer she received was, in effect, your life belongs partly to a community that will not assist in its ending. Canada's laws at the time did not permit physician-assisted death, and Rodriguez ultimately took her own life with the assistance of an anonymous doctor whose identity she protected to the grave. Today, Rodriguez could die legally in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Colombia, parts of Australia, several American states, and her own Canada, which legalized medical assistance in dying in 2016. But she could not die legally in most of the world. This geographical patchwork poses a challenge to the liberal framework that has dominated philosophical thinking about euthanasia for half a century. So if the right to die flows from fundamental principles of autonomy and self-determination, principles that know no borders, then its legal expression should be universal, not parochial. The fact that it is not universal suggests either that the philosophical case for euthanasia is weaker than its proponents believe, or that the relationship between free will and death is more complex than the liberal framework acknowledges. And in this essay, we develop the latter position. I argue that the tension between universal free will and localized euthanasia law illuminates three crucial dimensions of the problem that liberal theory tends to obscure. The first is the social embeddedness of choice, which means that even autonomous decisions about death are shaped by structures of meaning and power. Second, the paradoxical nature of choice itself, which can become a burden rather than a liberation. And third, the sense in which fate, understood not as predestination but as the given conditions of existence, is not the opposite of freedom but its precondition. The question, I suggest, is not whether we have free will to choose death, but what kind of freedom is possible when the choice is whether to exist at all. Let's talk about the liberal framework in more depth here. Autonomy and the right to die. The philosophical case for voluntary euthanasia rests on foundations laid by the Enlightenment's great architects of liberty. When John Stuart Mill argued in On Liberty that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, he provided the template for subsequent arguments about bodily autonomy and the limits of state power. If individuals are sovereign over their own bodies and lives, the reasoning runs that sovereignty must extend to the decision about whether continued existence is preferable to its alternative. Contemporary defenders of euthanasia have refined this intuition into a systematic philosophical position, As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, the central ethical argument for voluntary euthanasia is that respect for persons demands respect for their autonomous choices as long as those choices do not result in harm to others. This argument connects directly to the concept of competence. Autonomy presupposes the capacity for self-determination, and people have an interest in making important decisions about their lives in accordance with their own conception of how they want their lives to go. Since dying is part of living, choices about the manner and timing of death are integral to taking responsibility for one's existence. And this framework yields the 5 conditions that typically structure proposals for legalized voluntary euthanasia. The person must be suffering from a terminal illness, unlikely to benefit from a cure during remaining life expectancy, experiencing intolerable suffering or unacceptable burden, maintaining an enduring, voluntary, incompetent wish to die, and unable to commit suicide without assistance. These conditions represent an attempt to translate the abstract principle of autonomy into practical legal criteria to create what one scholar calls a moral case for voluntary euthanasia that can guide legislation and clinical practice. If we can give children puberty blockers and people cross-sex hormones whenever they want, why can't we choose to end our lives, in my opinion? That's where I'm coming from. Because you're ending one life to go to another life with the cross-sex hormones and surgery. The liberal framework has undeniable power, and it speaks to the intuition that individuals should not be forced to endure suffering they find meaningless, and that the state exceeds its legitimate authority when it compels continued existence against a person's deepest convictions. As one Chinese legal scholar puts it, framing the question that opened this essay, "Gentlemen, I want to ask you, if I cannot authorize my own death, then who is the master of this body? Who owns my life?" Yet, the liberal framework also raises questions it cannot easily answer. If autonomy is the supreme value, why does the legal recognition of euthanasia remain so limited? Why have societies that otherwise celebrate individual choice drawn back from this particular application? The answer, I suggest, lies not in the inconsistency of legislators, but in the inadequacy of the liberal framework itself, specifically in its failure to reckon with the social dimensions of choice and the paradoxical nature of autonomy when applied to the boundary conditions of existence. Now I would like to talk about the critique of liberal autonomy, domination, and social embeddedness. So the most searching critiques of the liberal case for euthanasia come not from religious traditionalists or defenders of the sanctity of life, but from philosophers who take autonomy seriously enough to ask what it actually requires. Mark Spindelman, in a penetrating analysis of the right to die debates, argues that conventional liberal arguments do not go far enough to recognize and address private, and in particular structural, forms of domination. The liberal framework, Spindelman contends, focuses on public domination, the state's interference with individual choice, while largely ignoring the private and structural forces that shape and constrain those choices. Now, this critique has profound implications for the euthanasia debate. When liberal theorists imagine the autonomous individual choosing death, they typically envision what Spindelman calls a strictly interpersonal model of domination, one private actor acting entirely on his own, dominating another. This model assumes that if we can eliminate coercion by specific individuals, if we can ensure that no one is pressuring the patient to die, then the resulting choice will be genuinely autonomous. But this assumption, Spindelman argues, holds true for virtually no one outside a small group of social elites, and perhaps not even them. What the liberal framework misses is the operation of ideologically driven, hierarchically arranged networks of private power that, in shadowy state-like ways, govern social life. These networks include the often intersecting social hierarchies of race, class, including professional status, sex, including sexuality, disability, health, age, religion, national origin, and citizenship status. For individuals situated within these hierarchies, which is to say for virtually everybody, choices about death are never simply expressions of autonomous will. They are shaped by cultural meaning, social expectations, economic pressures, and internalized norms that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. Let's consider, for example, how the meaning of a request for euthanasia might differ for an elderly person who has internalized cultural message about the burden of aging compared to a younger person whose identity is not similarly marked. Consider how economic pressures, the cost of continued care, the financial strain on family members might shape a person's sense of their options, even in the absence of explicit coercion. Consider how members of groups that have historically been devalued, people with disabilities, for instance, might experience the legalization of euthanasia differently from members of dominant groups. These are not questions about whether individuals are making voluntary choices in the narrow legal sense. They are questions about the social conditions that make genuine autonomy possible. Now, the liberal framework's neglect of these structural factors have a troubling implication. Legalizing euthanasia may actually affirmatively legitimates and protects the forms of private domination that constrain authentic choice. By focusing exclusively on preventing overt coercion, the law implicitly endorses the background conditions within which choices are made, conditions that may themselves be products of injustice. This is not an argument against legalization per se, but it is an argument that legalization, without serious attention to the structural determinants of choice, may fail to achieve the autonomy it promises. All right. Let's talk about the paradox of choice. When options become burdens. So the second critique of the liberal framework concerns not the conditions of choice, but the nature of choice itself. The liberal assumption is that more options are always better, that adding the option of euthanasia simply expands the range of autonomous possibilities available to individuals. But as philosophers and social theorists have recognized, this assumption is naive. David Vellman, in his critique of the right to die, draws on the work of Thomas Schelling and Gerald Dworkin to show how options can be harmful even when they are not exercised, and even when they are exercised and make the chooser better off. Schelling's insight came from game theory. In negotiation, the ability to make concessions can be a disadvantage because it leads one's opponent to hold out for more. The negotiator who cannot offer a pay cut may reach a better agreement than the negotiator who can, simply because the latter's options weaken his bargaining position. Now, this logic applies to euthanasia in ways that Vellman makes vivid. When a society legalizes assisted dying, it does not simply add an option. It changes the meaning of all the other options. Continued existence becomes implicitly a choice against death, a choice that may now carry moral weight it did not previously bear. As Vellman puts it, citing Yale Commissar's influential critique, will we not sweep up in the process some who are not really tired of life, but think others are tired of them, some who do not really want to die, but who feel they should not live on because to do so when there looms the legal alternative of euthanasia is to do a selfish or a cowardly act. The point is not that people will be mistaken about whether they want to die. Vellman explicitly assumes, for the sake of argument, that patients are infallible about their own preferences. The point is that having the option of euthanasia changes the social meaning of continuing to live. It transforms existence from a given into a choice, and with that transformation comes the possibility of guilt, of self-reproach, of the sense that one is imposing on others by refusing to take the available exit. Now, this is the paradox of autonomy in its starkest form. The very enhancement of choice that liberals celebrate may undermine the conditions in which choice can be freely made. The option to die becomes a burden to live, and this burden falls disproportionately on those who are already vulnerable, those who depend on others for care, who have internalized messages about their worthlessness, who lack the resources to resist the subtle pressures of family and society. As Vellman notes, what Commissar is questioning in this passage is not the practice of helping some patients to die, but rather the practice of asking them to choose whether to die. The very feature that proponents tout as an enhancement of autonomy, placing the choice in the patient's hands, may for some patients be a source of suffering rather than liberation. This analysis suggests that the geography of euthanasia law, the fact that it exists in some places and not others, may reflect not merely political contingency, but genuine moral complexity. Different societies may reasonably reach different conclusions about whether the benefits of adding this option outweigh the harms that come with it, and these conclusions may depend on local conditions, the structure of healthcare systems, cultural attitudes toward aging and disability, the strength of social safety nets, the history of eugenics and other abuses. The universal principle of autonomy, it turns out, does not dictate a universal legal conclusion. Let's talk about fate, finitude, and the limits of choice. The deepest challenge to the liberal framework concerns not the social conditions of choice or the paradoxes of options, but the nature of freedom itself in relation to death. The liberal imagination conceives of freedom as sovereignty, the power of the individual will to shape reality according to its desires. But death is the limit case of this conception. However we choose to die, we do not choose whether to die. Finitude is not an option. It is the given condition of existence. This insight points toward a different understanding of the relationship between free will and fate. In the liberal framework, fate appears as the enemy of freedom, the external constraint that limits the will's dominion. But one might also understand fate as the precondition of meaningful choice. We make decisions about our lives within a horizon of possibilities that we did not create and cannot ultimately control. Our mortality is not an imposition on our freedom, it is what gives our choices weight and significance. A being that could live forever would face decisions of an entirely different order, decisions that might, in an important sense, matter less because they could always be undone or deferred. This perspective illuminates what is at stake in the euthanasia debate. When we ask whether individuals should have the right to choose the timing and manner of their death, we are asking about the proper relationship between human agency and human finitude. The liberal answer that agency should extend as far as possible, that death should be brought within the domain of choice, has an obvious appeal. But it also risks a kind of hubris, the fantasy that we can master even the final limit of existence, that nothing need simply be undergone or endured. The critics of euthanasia who invoke the concept of dignity are often dismissed as religious traditionalists or paternalists, but some versions of this critique deserve more respect. As one commentator notes, drawing on Kantian philosophy, the dignity invoked in discussions of medical ethics as status supposedly threatened by physical deterioration and dependency cannot be the status whose claim on our moral concern is so fundamental to Kantian thought. The dignity that Kant identified with rational nature is not comprised by needing help to eat or use the bathroom. The worry then is that the word dignity is sometimes used to dignify, so to speak, our culture's obsession with independence, physical strength, and youth, an obsession that yields, a dignity that is ultimately incompatible with being cared for at all. Now, this is not an argument against euthanasia, but it is an argument against a certain justification for it. If we legalize assisted dying because we believe that dependence and vulnerability are incompatible with dignity, we may be reinforcing the very cultural attitudes that make dependence and vulnerability so difficult to bear. We may be telling disabled and elderly people that their lives are not worth living, that they are burdens, that the dignified response to their condition is to exit, and we may be doing this in the name of autonomy and choice. All right, let's talk about the legal geography of euthanasia between universal principle and local judgment. The argument so far suggests that the uneven legal landscape of euthanasia is not merely a contingent fact about political processes, but a reflection of genuine moral complexity. Different jurisdictions with different histories, cultures, and institutional arrangements may reasonably reach different conclusions about whether and how to legalize assisted dying. The universal principle of respect for autonomy does not dictate a single answer, because the meaning of autonomy in the context of dying depends on local conditions that vary across time and place. Let's consider the Netherlands, the first country to legalize voluntary euthanasia. The Dutch approach emerged from decades of clinical practice and public debate, and it operates within a healthcare system that provides universal coverage and extensive palliative care. The guidelines for euthanasia requiring unbearable suffering, a voluntary and well-considered request, consultation with another physician, and medical due care reflect a particular institutional context and a particular set of cultural assumptions about the doctor-patient relationship. What works in the Netherlands might not work elsewhere, and what works now might not have worked 40 years ago. Let's consider, too, the importance of what might be called a jurisprudence of limits. The European Court of Human Rights, in its 2011 judgment in Haas v. Switzerland, explicitly stated that Article 2 of the Convention guarantees no right to die, whether with the assistance of a third party or of the state. The right to life has no corresponding negative freedom. This is not necessarily a rejection of euthanasia. Switzerland itself permits assisted suicide under certain conditions, but it is a recognition that the right to live and the right to life cannot be simply inverted into a right to death. The positive freedom to live, which requires state protection and support, is not symmetrical with the negative freedom to die, which would require state abstention, or assistance. This asymmetry points toward a final reflection on the relationship between free will and fate. Perhaps the deepest reason for the geographical patchwork of euthanasia law is that the question it addresses, the question of how to die, is one that human beings have always answered differently and will always answer differently. The liberal framework promises to resolve this diversity through the universal principle of autonomy, but autonomy itself is not universal in its meaning or its applications. It is a concept that takes on specific content within specific traditions, communities, and ways of life. The right to choose death, like the right to marry or the right to free speech, is not an abstract principle that can be read off the nature of a personhood. It is a social achievement that depends on institutions, practices, and shared understandings that are always local and always fragile. Now let's conclude here. Owning our deaths. Sue Rodriguez's question: if I cannot approve my death, then whose body is this? If I cannot approve my own death, then whose body is this? Who owns my life remains powerful because it captures a deep intuition about self-possession and autonomy, but the analysis in this essay suggests that the question is more complicated than it appears. None of us fully owns our lives because our lives are constituted by relationships, histories, and meanings that we didn't create and cannot control. We are born into a world not of our making, and we die leaving a world we will not see. Between birth and death, we exercise a limited and conditioned agency, an agency that is real but never absolute, free but never serene. The legalization of euthanasia in a minority of places reflects this complexity, represents an acknowledgement that individuals should have some say in how they die, that the state's power to compel continued existence has limits, that suffering can become meaningless and dignity can be undermined. But the fact that legalization remains limited also reflects an acknowledgement, implicit but real, that choices about death are never simply individual, that they are shaped by social structures and cultural meanings, that the option to die can become a burden to live, and that the proper response to human finitude is not mastery but acceptance. The task for philosophy and for law is to hold these insights together, to honor the aspiration to autonomy while recognizing its limits, to respect individual choice while attending to its social conditions, to affirm the value of self-determination while acknowledging that some things, including death itself, are ultimately not chosen but undergone. In the geography of euthanasia law, we see a global conversation about these questions, a conversation that has reached different conclusions in different places because the questions themselves admit of multiple reasonable answers. That diversity is not a failure of universal principle, but an expression of it, a recognition that the meaning of freedom, like the meaning of death, is worked out in particular communities by particular people, facing particular circumstances that none of us chose and all of us must finally face. With peace and love, thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.